In 1887, on the icy streets of Massachusetts, something inexplicable happened, an event so mysterious that even today, more than 100 years later, no one has been able to unravel it. The case that haunted the entire city remains unsolved, and the questions, more than answers, persist. What happened that night? On the freezing streets of Massachusetts, a strange and disturbing case began to take shape. The scene, which until then seemed tranquil and typical of a small 19th-century American town, would soon become a point of interest for everyone, from the curious to researchers, from skeptics to believers. The story began with a simple event, but with an outcome that would defy all possible explanations. Back then, the town of Westborough was known for its simple wooden houses and quiet streets. But in the winter of that year, a series of unsettling and inexplicable events began to trouble the inhabitants. No one imagined that what would follow would go down in history as one of the greatest mysteries of the state of Massachusetts. It all began on a cold January night when Thomas Harding, a city man known for his seriousness and the quiet life he led with his wife and children, became involved in a situation no one could have foreseen. Harding, a respected accountant, had no known enemies. His only flaw, if you can call it that, was his habit of occasionally spending hours in his office studying old family documents and letters. Nothing seemed to suggest that he would be part of something that would change the city forever. It was that night that Harding disappeared, as if he had evaporated into thin air. His office was intact, the door locked from the inside, and the windows closed. But he wasn't there. What seemed like a simple, sudden escape became an enigma, with pieces of the puzzle missing. The city, with its snow-covered streets and the silence of the night, was now facing something that not even its most experienced citizens could comprehend. When the local police investigated, everything indicated that Harding had left the house in a hurry. What piqued everyone's interest, however, was the discovery of a letter written by Harding found on his desk. It was dated hours before his disappearance. The letter didn't make sense. In an enigmatic tone, Harding mentioned that something was coming, something he couldn't control, and that he needed to leave before it was too late. The letter said nothing more. It was as if he had been interrupted at the moment of writing something more important. The town was divided between those who believed Harding had simply run away to escape some kind of personal crisis, and those who thought the mystery ran deeper. With Harding's disappearance, fear spread. Was he the victim of a crime, or was something more sinister at play? The mystery deepened when, a few days later, something strange happened. A witness claimed to have seen Harding on a deserted street, but he looked visibly different. His eyes were empty, as if he were no longer the same man. He didn't recognize the witness, who was paralyzed with fear upon realizing that Harding seemed to no longer be who he was. This was the first sign that something unnatural was happening, but no one knew for sure what. A few weeks later, another shocking discovery was made. An old local legend began to be linked to the case. Longtime residents spoke of a mysterious disappearance that had occurred years earlier, in a case involving the same Harding family. The story, which had been set aside for a long time, gained traction as coincidences began to emerge. The same location, the same strange behavior, and the same unsolved mystery. The fact that a similar case had occurred decades earlier only fueled the mystery. Now the researchers found themselves in a dilemma. Was Harding's disappearance related to a real crime, or was something more supernatural at play? The answers seemed distant, and with each new clue, the case became more perplexing. The truth is that no one really knew what had happened on that cold January night, but the case spread like wildfire, generating rumors and theories. Some said Harding had been the victim of a conspiracy, while others believed that unseen forces had taken him. What seemed certain was that Thomas Harding's disappearance was not an isolated event, but rather part of a larger mystery yet to be revealed. The town of Westborough would never be the same after that January of 1887. Thomas Harding and the mystery of his disappearance became the center of local discussions, and as time passed, the case lost more and more logical explanations, becoming one of the greatest unsolved legends of the region. What do you think happened to Thomas Harding? Did he really disappear because of a conspiracy, or is there something more supernatural at play? Leave your opinion in the comments. The mystery of Thomas Harding's disappearance quickly gripped every corner of Westborough. But while the town was engulfed in speculation, few truly grasped the complexities behind this unusual event. To understand what had happened, it was necessary to understand the place and the people who inhabited it. Westborough was a city with a rich history. Founded in the early years of American colonization, its cobblestone streets and Victorian-style mansions reflected a past full of significant events. But at the same time, it was a city paralyzed by the weight of time. The people there were like those old houses, rigid and unchanging, with a certain resistance to the new. Nothing changed for long, and things happened slowly. The seasons passed, but the city remained the same. However, Harding's disappearance brought something new, a feeling of uncertainty, and as the town began to recover from the unrest, other characters began to emerge, each with their own version of the story, each with their own interpretations. First, there was the police officer in charge of the investigation, Jonathan Parker, a middle-aged man with extensive experience dealing with small local crimes. Parker was a reserved type of man who didn't believe in fantastical stories or supernatural theories. He preferred the tangible and explainable world, where answers could be found in concrete evidence and careful interrogations. However, he soon found himself immersed in something he couldn't understand. Parker began interviewing those closest to Harding, but no one knew much. His wife, Elizabeth Harding, seemed to be in shock since the night of the disappearance. Without clear answers as to what had happened, she spoke little, and when she did, her voice trembled. Her behavior indicated that she had more information than she was willing to reveal, but she couldn't or wouldn't talk. There was a deep fear in her eyes, a fear she didn't know how to hide. Besides Elizabeth, there was Thomas's brother, George Harding. George had always been the most impulsive of the family, known for his strong personality and radical opinions. Unlike Thomas, who had always been discreet and introspective, George wasn't afraid to speak his mind. When the case was investigated, he was one of the first to raise suspicions about what might have happened. According to him, Thomas had begun to change his behavior in the months leading up to his disappearance. He was more distant, as if he were in conflict with himself. George suggested that his brother might be involved in something he didn't understand, something beyond his control. Conversations with George led Parker to a point of reflection. If Thomas's change in behavior was a reflection of something bigger, perhaps the answer to the disappearance wasn't as simple as it first seemed. That man, so meticulous and calculating, was beginning to become an enigma to everyone around him. Parker began to question his own rationalist view. He was no longer dealing with a simple disappearance investigation. He was facing an unexplained mystery. As the investigation progressed, another crucial character entered the scene. Samuel Quinn, a local historian who happened to know something that could shed light on the mystery. Samuel was a solitary man, involved in ancient and rare studies of the city's legends and stories. He knew more about the events that occurred in Westborough than anyone else, especially the stories forgotten for generations. Quinn claimed to have found records connecting the Harding family to old mysteries involving unsolved disappearances. According to him, the city had a long history of unexplained events, and the case of Thomas Harding seemed to be just another chapter in a story yet to be concluded. For Samuel, Harding's disappearance was not an isolated event, but rather a continuation of a series of strange occurrences dating back centuries. He believed the disappearance had deep roots, linked to a historical event involving an ancient curse. But Samuel, like everyone else, had no proof to support his claims, only speculation and fragments of a story that seemed far from being unraveled. The Harding mystery was thus transforming into something far greater than it had seemed. The town, its inhabitants and the investigators found themselves entangled in a web of secrets and lies, and clues were everywhere, waiting to be connected. Doubt hung in the air, like a fog that refused to dissipate. Do you believe that Thomas Harding's disappearance has deeper roots than a simple escape, or was he the victim of a conspiracy? Leave your opinion in the comments. The case of Thomas Harding was no longer just an ordinary disappearance. As the investigation progressed, the conflict took on unexpected proportions. The mystery was deepening, and those involved were beginning to realize that they were not dealing with a simple case of escape or crime. Something more was happening in Westborough, something that, in time, would become impossible to ignore. Jonathan Parker, the police officer in charge of the case, was beginning to feel the pressure from his superiors. Expectations for a quick solution were high, but he knew he was facing a puzzle that challenged all his investigative skills. With each clue that emerged, new questions arose, but the answers were evasive, as if the case itself were hiding, just waiting for the right moment to be revealed. Parker, unable to find logical explanations, felt adrift. He didn't believe in superstitions or unexplained phenomena, but tension was gripping the city, and it was even affecting his own clarity of thought. When Harding's disappearance was widely reported, an increasingly popular theory began to circulate. Was it a repeat of what had happened more than 50 years earlier to another member of the Harding family? The idea of a curse spread like wildfire, fueled by the lack of rational answers. The town of Westborough, accustomed to its tranquil routine, was now divided between those who accepted the supernatural theory and those who insisted on seeking a more logical explanation. People murmured in the streets, creating stories and spreading rumors, while Parker struggled to maintain order and find the truth. Tensions rose when, one night, a shocking new event occurred. Elizabeth Harding, Thomas's wife, began acting even more strangely. She no longer left the house and avoided any contact with the neighbors. The few times she was seen, her eyes seemed vacant, as if something were consuming her from within. What had once been a silent grief now seemed like a disconnection from reality. Each day she seemed more distant, as if she were being swallowed by the shadow of her husband's mystery. Rumors about the Harding family curse began to gain traction, and even the most skeptical people began to question what could be happening. The theory of Samuel Quinn, the local historian, which linked Thomas's disappearance to an ancient mystery, began to be discussed in the taverns and squares of Westborough. Quinn said that the Harding family had been marked by an inexplicable event that occurred in the 1830s, an event that involved a similar disappearance. According to him, a supernatural force seemed to follow the family members, and now Thomas Harding was paying the price for a mistake of his ancestors. Meanwhile, Thomas's brother, George Harding, who until then seemed to be only a secondary character, began to gain prominence. George, known for his explosive temper, was determined to find his brother. He completely opposed the idea of a curse, insisting that Thomas had been the victim of something more tangible. For him, the disappearance was a crime, and he would do whatever it took to uncover the truth. But George, in his search for answers, began asking too many questions. He got too close to dangerous people, investigating areas of the city that were better left in the past. His aggressive methods began to worry others, including Parker, who saw his investigation being interfered with. George, however, was not willing to give up. He believed his family was the target of a conspiracy that went back to ancient times, and he was willing to go to the ends of the earth to unearth the truth. The town of Westborough was now divided, with a growing sense that something much bigger was at stake. The mystery of Thomas Harding had become a symbol of the struggle between the rationale and the irrational, the mundane and the supernatural. But the answers still seemed beyond everyone's reach, as if the case itself were playing tricks on its investigators, offering false leads and endless enigmas. And then, on a cold night, something happened that would change everything. A new witness appeared, someone who claimed to have seen Thomas Harding on the night of his disappearance. This witness was no ordinary person, but someone with a dark past and involved in clandestine activities. The truth this person had to reveal could finally give everyone the answers they so desperately sought, but it could also put them on an even more dangerous path. Parker knew the case was about to take a new turn, and he was about to discover that the more he investigated, the further he strayed from the truth he had always believed to be the only possible one. Do you think the appearance of a new witness could finally bring answers to the Thomas Harding case, or will it only complicate things further? Leave your opinion in the comments. The mystery surrounding Thomas Harding's disappearance grew increasingly intricate, and as the investigation progressed, new layers of complexity emerged. Parker, still tormented by conflicting theories, began to realize that the case was no longer a simple criminal investigation. The subplots that emerged were becoming increasingly interconnected, and the very setting of Westboro seemed to be a key piece in unraveling this enigma. Meanwhile, tension between the characters was rising, and relationships that were once clear and predictable began to unravel. Most notably, Jonathan Parker's frustration grew. He no longer knew who to trust. The line between what was rational and what was supernatural began to blur, and he found himself torn between the obligation to solve the case and the desire to understand what was really happening in Westboro. Elizabeth Harding, Thomas's wife, was withdrawing more and more from everyone around her. For days, she didn't leave her house, remaining in complete isolation. The neighbors began to speculate about her behavior, some saying she was possessed by grief, others suggesting she knew more than she was willing to reveal. But for Parker, there was something even more disturbing about her attitude. Elizabeth seemed to be in a trance, as if she were waiting for something that hadn't yet happened. There was an expectation in the air, a feeling that she was being consumed by a force she couldn't control. While the police investigated Thomas's disappearance, George Harding grew increasingly aggressive in his search for answers. He searched every corner of Westboro for clues, questioning residents and exploring the city's darkest corners. In his relentless pursuit, George began to become an increasingly isolated figure. He distanced himself from his own family, especially Elizabeth, with whom he had a strained relationship since the death of his parents. George's frustration was palpable, and his erratic behavior made his search even harder to control. However, something else was happening behind the scenes. Samuel Quinn, the local historian, who had already become a key figure in the case, began to delve deeper into Westboro's old records. He was convinced that Thomas Harding's disappearance was somehow linked to past events, something that had been overlooked and forgotten by younger generations. Quinn spent nights in libraries and archives, searching for clues that could shed light on the mystery. His obsession with the case led him to make unusual connections between old texts and the Harding family. One of the most impactful discoveries Samuel made involved an ancient legend about a secret pact made by one of Thomas Harding's ancestors, said to have brought a curse upon the family. According to records, the pact had been sealed on a stormy night, and the price to be paid across generations was yet to come. Samuel believed the key to solving the mystery lay in this ancient curse. But how could he prove something that might just be a story? As the subplots intertwined, the pressure on Parker mounted. The town of Westboro was in tatters, with each new development in the case causing an even greater division among the residents. Some clung to the idea of a curse. Others were convinced that Thomas Harding was involved in something more criminal. The dilemma was growing, and Parker no longer knew where to look for answers. Tensions reached their peak when an unexpected event occurred. A major storm hit Westborough on the very day Thomas Harding had disappeared. The seemingly natural phenomenon was seen by many as confirmation of the legend circulating in the town. To Parker, the storm seemed like a sign, a link between the past and the present, but he didn't know how to interpret it. What had happened in 1830 when the pact had been sealed? And how did that relate to Thomas's disappearance? With the arrival of the storm, the city was forced to confront the reality of what was happening. Each character, from Parker to George and Elizabeth, seemed to be on the verge of an emotional breakdown, consumed by the need to understand the mystery. Relationships between them were increasingly strained, and everyone seemed to be drifting apart as the truth about what happened that night in 1887 seemed more distant than ever. Do you believe the legend of a curse has anything to do with Thomas Harding's disappearance, or is it all just a coincidence? Leave your opinion in the comments. The town of Westborough, already shrouded in mystery and distrust, was about to be thrown into a new direction. The case of Thomas Harding, which seemed to be following the course of a routine investigation, took an unexpected turn that would transform everyone involved and forever alter the fate of Westborough. Jonathan Parker, exhausted by the pressure and the relentless search for answers, made his first major discovery when he revisited the city's old records. He was no longer just looking for a logical or concrete explanation, but was now willing to explore any clue that might bring the truth to light. It was at this moment that something seemingly insignificant stood out. An old logbook belonging to Thomas Harding's grandfather, which spoke of a pact with the shadows, an expression Parker found exaggerated, but which he couldn't help but consider in light of recent events. The diary described an event that occurred in 1830, in which an ancestor of Thomas Harding, a man named Edward Harding, allegedly made a dark pact with a mysterious entity. According to the records, this pact was made to ensure prosperity and longevity for the family, but at the price of a shadow that would follow the Harding lineage for generations, collecting its debt unexpectedly. The diary also spoke of a stormy night when Edward Harding disappeared without a trace, as if taken by something supernatural. The diary seemed to offer a direct connection between what had happened in 1830 and Thomas's disappearance, but Parker remained skeptical. As a rationalist police officer, he didn't believe in supernatural pacts, but the coincidences were undeniable. The storm that coincided with Thomas's disappearance, the description of the pact, and the connection to past events were beginning to intertwine in an alarming way. However, the real turning point came when Samuel Quinn, the historian, revealed a discovery that no one could have predicted. Quinn was becoming increasingly obsessed with the case, and in his research had found an old correspondence between Edward Harding and a man named Matthias Crowley, a strange visitor who had arrived in Westborough at the time of the pact. Crowley, according to the records, was an enigmatic man of unknown origin, but with a supernatural power that seemed to control the events around him. Quinn, with his deep knowledge of local legends, suggested that Crowley might be more than just an outsider. He believed that Crowley was, in fact, a kind of agent of a greater force, a being that fed on the souls of those involved in pacts like Edward Harding's. According to Quinn, Thomas Harding's disappearance was no accident, but part of a cycle that had begun decades earlier, with the price of the curse being exacted with each generation. Meanwhile, Elizabeth Harding's behavior was becoming increasingly disturbing. She seemed more restless than ever, her eyes fixed on something no one else could see. Her mental health was deteriorating as she delved deeper into the legends surrounding her family. On one particularly difficult night, she confessed something no one expected to hear. She knew what was happening. She knew about the curse, and somehow she believed her husband Thomas had tried to break the cycle. But in trying to do so, he had become the next target of the shadow that haunted his lineage. Elizabeth revealed that in the days before Thomas's disappearance, he had found a way to break the pact. but knew it could have a terrible cost. She didn't know exactly what he had done, but she feared he had become involved in something he couldn't control. And now, with the growing sense that something dark was approaching, she feared for her children's future. That night, as the storm intensified, a mysterious figure appeared at the Harding house. Parker, who was investigating Elizabeth's house for more clues, was surprised to see a hooded man with pale skin and piercing eyes approaching with an eerie calm. The man, without saying a word, entered the house, and time seemed to stand still. Parker followed him, determined to find out who he was, but before he could reach him, the man vanished into thin air. It was as if he had been swallowed by the night itself. However, something remained behind, a letter similar to the one Thomas had left before disappearing. It was addressed to Elizabeth and spoke of a choice to be made, a choice that could free the Harding family, but one that would require a sacrifice. Parker, unsure what to do with this new evidence, felt the pressure mounting. He was no longer just dealing with an ordinary disappearance. He was grappling with a story that stretched back generations, and the consequences were closer than he had imagined. Do you believe the mysterious man who appeared at the Harding house is a supernatural being or someone trying to manipulate events? What do you think he wanted? Leave your opinion in the comments. The town of Westborough would never be the same again. The disappearance of Thomas Harding, which initially seemed like an isolated case, had now taken on a dimension that no one could have foreseen. The revelation of the ancient pact, the enigmatic letter, and the appearance of the mysterious man were just the first signs that something much bigger was at stake. But what did this mean for everyone involved? What would be the consequences for the characters, and how would they react to this new reality unfolding before them? Jonathan Parker, still reeling from the unfolding events, felt as if he were walking through a minefield. Each clue he uncovered seemed to raise more questions than answers, and as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, the picture grew darker and more dangerous. He knew the city was on the brink of crisis, but he had no idea how to stop what seemed to be rapidly approaching. The turning point for Parker was Elizabeth Harding's revelation. When she confessed that she knew about the curse and that Thomas had tried to break it, the doubts surrounding the case intensified. Thomas's wife, who had remained silent throughout the investigation, now seemed to bear the weight of the truth. And as if that weren't enough, her final confession revealed an even more disturbing truth. She feared that in trying to break the pact, Thomas had sacrificed himself to free his family from eternal pain. But had he failed? Or had he simply become a victim of his own attempt at redemption? Parker then realized he was no longer dealing with a simple disappearance case. He was involved in something that transcended logical understanding and stirred forces he couldn't control. He knew he could no longer rely solely on reason to solve this mystery. Now he needed to understand the essence of what was happening, and what he discovered in the next few hours would change everything. Meanwhile, George Harding, Thomas's brother, became increasingly obsessed with finding the truth. His anger and frustration, fueled by the idea that his family was the victim of a larger conspiracy, consumed him from within. He didn't believe in supernatural pacts. For him, the blame lay somewhere far more tangible, and he wouldn't rest until he found an explanation that made sense. But his actions began to take a dangerous turn. The obsession with the truth led George to begin his own investigations, disregarding police guidance, and his actions began to affect those around him. George searched for answers in the shadows, digging deeper and deeper into old files and records, until he discovered a sinister connection to a series of other disappearances in the city. It wasn't just the Hardings who were being marked. Other families had also suffered similar losses over the years, with patterns that, at first, seemed like coincidences, but which, as George investigated, began to connect. To him, this wasn't the work of the supernatural, but of a secret network, an ancient conspiracy that had spanned generations. George's behavior began to affect his relationships with others. The town, which had previously seen him as a pragmatic man, began to view him as unbalanced, consumed by a thirst for revenge. Elizabeth, in particular, feared for him. She knew that if George continued to seek answers with such fury, he would be digging his own grave. As the mystery deepened, Samuel Quinn continued his research. His obsession with the town's history and the Harding curse had made him an increasingly reclusive figure. He believed the key to understanding Thomas's disappearance lay in a historical event he had uncovered in his archives. Quinn's theory, however, grew increasingly compelling as he unraveled the details of the original pact. It wasn't just the Harding family at stake, but all the families involved in Edward Harding's pact. Samuel believed a great catastrophe was coming, something that could affect the entire town. And with that, the pieces he gathered became more ominous. For Elizabeth, all that remained of her sanity was the attempt to protect her children. She knew that what was happening to Thomas was only the beginning of something much bigger. She found herself torn between the hope that her husband might return and the fear that he would bring irreparable destruction with him. Her mental health was on the verge of collapse, and while Parker investigated, she began to question whether she should tell everything she knew. She felt immense guilt, as if the weight of what was happening was her responsibility, but she didn't know how she could help without putting everyone at risk. The disappearance of Thomas Harding not only divided the town of Westborough, but also the people involved in the case. Everyone's reactions were more than predictable. They were being shaped by the shadow of an unknown past, which continued to cast a long shadow over the present. The conflict intensified with each step, and the town was on the verge of exploding in a confrontation between those who sought a rational explanation and those who knew that the supernatural had much to do with everything that was happening. Do you think George Harding's obsession with uncovering the truth is putting the town and his family in danger, or is he on the right track to uncovering the real cause of his brother's disappearance? Leave your opinion in the comments. Tension in Westborough continued to rise, as if the town were on the brink of total collapse. The residents, divided between those who believed in supernatural explanations and those who sought a more rational one, were all somehow involved in the mystery of Thomas Harding's disappearance. For some, the case had become an obsession, while for others, a struggle for the truth that could change their lives forever. Jonathan Parker, the skeptical police officer, was at the center of it all. Throughout the investigation, he had undergone a profound transformation. Initially, he saw himself as the champion of reason and logic, someone who could solve any mystery if he were diligent enough. However, as the Thomas Harding case deepened, Parker felt his worldview being challenged. The line between rational and irrational began to blur before him, and he no longer knew who to trust. The most difficult part was the internal struggle he waged. Was he simply being manipulated, or was there something bigger at play, something he couldn't comprehend? Parker knew he was facing something that transcended the limits of a police investigation. It was as if the mystery itself had a life of its own, changing as he tried to move forward, leading him to question everything he knew about the world. In his relentless search for answers, he felt that something was leading him to a destiny he couldn't control. The city of Westborough seemed to be becoming a prison for him, where the mystery offered no answers, only more questions. Parker's turning point came when he finally came face to face with the truth, not through physical clues or witnesses, but through a personal revelation that shook him deeply. During one of the most intense nights of his investigation, he had a vision. It wasn't an ordinary vision, but an almost mystical experience where he found himself transported to a scene from Westborough's past. It was a stormy night, similar to the one in which Thomas Harding had disappeared, and at the center of that scene was Edward Harding, the patriarch of the family, making his pact with a dark entity. This vision, which seemed more like a vivid nightmare than a memory, made Parker realize that the mystery of Thomas Harding wasn't simply about a man's disappearance, but about a force that had been ignored for generations. He finally understood that Edward Harding's pact and his connection to the supernatural entity weren't just legends or myths. They were the key to understanding what was happening to the Harding family. Upon waking from the vision, Parker was stunned. He didn't know what to make of the information, but what he felt was clear. He could no longer treat the case as a simple police investigation. Thomas Harding's disappearance was linked to something much bigger, something that defied any conventional explanation. It was a battle between forces he couldn't control, but which he now knew he had to confront. George Harding, for his part, was also undergoing a transformation. His search for answers had led him to a point of no return. He was no longer the man who had come to Westborough looking for his brother. The obsession with uncovering the truth had changed him in a way he couldn't understand. His anger, once a driving force, now seemed to be consuming him from the inside out. When George discovered, through his own investigation, that Edward Harding's pact was directly linked to Thomas's disappearance, he had a moment of clarity. He realized that what was happening to his family wasn't simply a matter of justice or revenge. It was a fight for their very survival. The pact, sealed so long ago, seemed to be taking its toll, and he was next in line. But the real turning point for George came when he had to confront the truth about his own guilt. The quest for revenge, which had fueled his journey up to that point, gave way to a painful realization that he was becoming what he feared most, someone consumed by hatred and the need for control. He understood that, to save his family, he would need to abandon this path of destruction and accept responsibility for his own part in the Harding family legacy. The greatest challenge, however, would be for Elizabeth Harding. After the revelation that Thomas had tried to break the pact and sacrificed himself for his family, Elizabeth fell into a state of despair. She felt guilty, as if her inaction had led Thomas to his tragic fate. The weight of loss and guilt afflicted her deeply, but at the same time, she felt an urgent need to protect her children and prevent the curse from perpetuating itself. Elizabeth finally made a difficult decision. She knew that if she didn't confront the past and break the cycle, her family would continue to suffer forever. She could no longer allow fear and guilt to rule her. With the help of Parker and George, she took the initiative to find a way to finally break her family's pact, knowing that it would mean making an immense personal sacrifice. The path she chose would not be easy, but it was necessary. Throughout her journey, Elizabeth went from a woman consumed by pain and fear to someone who took responsibility for her own redemption. She, like Parker and George, had to grow in the face of adversity and accept that winning the battle against the curse would require painful sacrifices. And in the end, she would become one of the strongest figures in Westborough's history, alongside her children, willing to face whatever was necessary to protect those she loved. Do you think George and Elizabeth are finally ready to face the consequences of the Harding family curse? Or is there still something missing for them to truly overcome what haunts them? Leave your opinion in the comments. The silence in Westborough was growing increasingly oppressive. The town, once proud of its tranquility and stable routine, was now gripped by an indescribable air of tension. The revelation of the ancient pact and the efforts of Parker, George, and Elizabeth to break the curse had brought everyone to a critical point. Each character was about to face their final choices, and what happened next could change everyone's fate forever. Jonathan Parker, now certain that Thomas Harding's disappearance was linked to something far greater than a simple crime, felt the weight of his responsibility growing each day. His perception of reality had shifted. He knew that by confronting the mystery of Thomas, he risked plunging into a world from which he could no longer escape. The Harding family pact, the presence of the dark entity, All of this was leading him to a fine line between reason and the inexplicable. For him, there was only one choice: to confront once and for all what lay behind this tragedy, or to abandon the search and let the mystery consume them all. Alongside Parker, Elizabeth was determined to break with her family's legacy and do whatever it took to free her children and her town from the curse that had haunted them for generations. She knew that the final stage of the fight against the supernatural force that tormented her lineage would require drastic action. The decision she had made to confront the past and try to break the pact had not been easy, but she was willing to go all the way, no matter the cost. She feared what she would have to do, but she knew it would be the only chance to save her family and restore peace to Westborough. George Harding, who had lost himself in his quest for revenge, was now beginning to see the situation in a new light. His obsession with the truth and his rage against his family's curse had cost him dearly. He knew that the only way to save himself and those he loved was to abandon the destructive path he had followed until then. He needed to accept responsibility for his choices without further questioning or relentless searching. The real battle was not in finding culprits, but in understanding how he could finally free himself from what was consuming him. Redemption did not come through revenge, but through accepting what his family's fate truly meant. However, the three were aware that the worst was yet to come. The entity that haunted the Harding family and the town of Westborough was not willing to surrender without a fight. Parker, Elizabeth, and George had prepared for the confrontation, but something inside them told them that the next few hours would be decisive, not only for their lives, but for the future of everyone who lived in that town. The rain was falling heavily again, and the storm, which had always been associated with the darkest moments in Westborough's history, seemed to signal the climax of everything that had happened up to that point. Night was about to fall, and a sense of foreboding gripped the town. The fear that had spread among the residents was now concentrated in the Harding house, where the family's fate and the secret of their past would finally be revealed. Elizabeth, now aware of the sacrifice required to break the pact, was preparing for a moment she knew would change everything. She knew that what was about to happen would not only be a choice for her family, but for everyone else still alive. The decision to face the unknown and confront the supernatural entity meant that she and her children could live free, but also that the town of Westborough would have to pay a price for what had happened. Parker, still torn between what reason told him and the evidence pointing to something he couldn't understand, prepared for the final stage of the investigation. His mission was no longer just to understand the case, but to confront the horrors hidden behind Thomas Harding's disappearance and the curse consuming his family. He knew that the truth, however terrifying, needed to be faced so that the city could heal. The tension was palpable, and what would happen next would be the final showdown. The city of Westborough was about to witness a battle that, regardless of the outcome, would forever change the course of history. The characters were ready to act, each confronting what remained of their fears, traumas, and dilemmas. But deep down, they knew that the outcome would not depend solely on their choices, but on the power of something much greater, a force that had lingered for generations and was now about to demand its price. Do you think Elizabeth's sacrifice will be enough to break the Harding family curse, or will something even more unexpected happen? Leave your opinion in the comments. Night had fallen over Westborough with an unusual darkness, as if the city itself were awaiting the outcome of a drama that had stretched across generations. The wind cut through the streets, and the rain seemed relentless, making the atmosphere even denser and more charged with tension. However, the storm, which had always been associated with moments of despair and uncertainty, now seemed to be the prelude to the most anticipated moment. Inside the Harding house, the atmosphere was suffocating. Elizabeth, Parker, and George were together, but the emotional distance between them had never been so clear. Each prepared for the inevitable, each with their own fears and expectations, but without knowing exactly what would happen. The decision to confront the dark entity and break the ancestral pact had been made, but for them, all that remained was the uncertainty of the price to be paid for their choices. Elizabeth, now aware that her sacrifice was necessary to secure her family's freedom, took the first step. She positioned herself in the center of the room, her eyes fixed on a distant point, as if silently conversing with something or someone invisible. The lit candles around her flickered, and the air seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. The sound of the storm outside mingled with the heavy silence that filled the room. Parker, who until that moment had maintained his rational and analytical stance, now felt the gravity of the situation in a personal way. He was there, not just as an investigator, but as a man confronting his own limitations in the face of something inexplicable. What had begun as a simple missing person case now placed him at the epicenter of a battle between the physical and the supernatural worlds. His heart beat faster, but at the same time, he felt more determined than ever. He knew that the only way out for the town of Westboro and for his own soul was to face what was about to happen. George, for his part, found himself in a state of inner conflict. He had sought revenge, searched for answers, but now understood that his journey was far from simple. The hatred that had given him strength until that moment began to dissipate in the face of the reality of the situation. He knew that, to save his family, he could no longer cling to anger. He had to accept not only what was happening, but what he needed to do to redeem the mistakes of his own life. He grew closer to Elizabeth, and for the first time, the true connection between them became evident. It was no longer a matter of guilt or frustration, but of acceptance and unity. As the three prepared, the Harding house seemed to transform. The air grew even thicker, as if an invisible presence were taking over everything. The heat intensified, and the shadows on the walls seemed to come alive, moving in patterns that were difficult to comprehend. Suddenly, a shadowy figure appeared in the room, silent but powerful. It was the hooded man Parker had seen days before, but now his presence was more intense, more menacing. He didn't speak, but his energy seemed to engulf everything around him. Elizabeth looked at Parker and George. She knew this was the decisive moment. The fight they were about to wage would not only be physical, but also spiritual. She knew that to break her family's pact, she would have to go beyond the limits of what was possible. Without another word, she stepped forward, facing the shadowy figure that now seemed to have materialized before them. She knew the entity had come to collect the price for what had been done years before. The figure approached slowly, his presence almost suffocating. He looked directly at Elizabeth, and for the first time, she felt the weight of the entire curse that hung over her family. "Are you willing to pay the price?" His voice sounded like a whisper, but the impact of his words was like thunder in Elizabeth's heart. She took a deep breath, facing the being with more courage than she had ever imagined she possessed. "Yes, I am willing," she replied, her voice firm without hesitation. "For my children, for my family, for Westboro." The man smiled, but it was a cruel smile, one that seemed to carry the pain of 1,000 lost souls. He reached out his hand, and as he touched it, a wave of energy coursed through Elizabeth's body, causing her to fall to her knees. Parker and George rushed to help her, but something prevented them from getting closer. The room seemed to distort, and the energy was taking on unimaginable proportions. Then a loud bang reverberated through the house. The shadows began to writhe, and the entity let out a guttural scream that seemed to come from all directions. Elizabeth, with the strength of her will, resisted, despite the excruciating pain that consumed her. The energy forming around her began to change color, from a black shadow to a golden glow. She felt that the sacrifice was about to be consummated, and at the same time that the curse was about to be broken. The weight of ancestry, of past choices, was finally dissipating. The climax of it all was an explosion of light and darkness. The entity screamed, its form disappearing as if swallowed by the very darkness of its existence. Elizabeth fell to the ground, exhausted but victorious. The pact had been broken. The storm outside began to subside, and for the first time in days, peace seemed to return to Westborough. Do you believe Elizabeth made the right sacrifice to break the curse? What do you think will happen to her and her family now? Leave your opinion in the comments. When silence finally settled over Westborough, it seemed as if the entire city had exhaled a collective breath, relieved of the weight it had carried for generations. Elizabeth Harding's sacrifice, the confrontation with the dark entity, and the breaking of the pact that had haunted her family were finally accomplished. The city, now free from the curse that tormented it, began to experience a peace it had never imagined possible. But the real question was, what would happen to those who had faced evil head-on? Exhausted, Elizabeth Harding lay in her living room, still reeling from what had happened. She felt the pain of an immense weight lifted from her shoulders, but at the same time, a strange emptiness filled her heart. What she feared most was that victory over evil would come at a higher cost than she was willing to pay. She knew that although the curse would be broken, the emotional and spiritual scars would remain with her and her family forever. But looking at her children, she felt a profound peace, the peace that their future would be different from the dark past that had haunted her all her life. Jonathan Parker, who had followed every moment of the investigation and the fight against the entity, now felt his mission was complete. Initially, he was skeptical, a man of logic and reason who believed everything could be explained rationally. But after everything that had happened, Parker knew that reality was far more complex than he had ever imagined. He now carried within him a truth that transcended reason. He knew that the city of Westborough and the people who inhabited it would never be the same. He also knew that in some way he had been transformed in that process, not just as a police officer, but as a man. He had learned that sometimes the answers are not where logic tells us to look, but where our hearts guide us. George Harding, now calmer and more introspective, knew his journey was far from over. The vengeance and anger that had guided him to that point had dissipated in the face of the reality of what had happened. He now understood that true freedom lay not in repaying evil with more evil, but in accepting the pain and moving on. George knew his path would be one of reconciliation, both with his family and with himself. The curse of his lineage had been broken, but he still had to learn to deal with the ghosts of the past and the choices that had defined him up to that point. The town of Westborough, meanwhile, was in the process of healing. The residents, who had lived in fear and distrust for so long, began to rebuild their lives. The ghost of the curse that had haunted the town for so long had vanished, but the weight of history remained, reminding everyone that however much the darkness dissipates, the marks of what was lived through do not disappear immediately. Elizabeth and her family, with the support of Parker and George, began a new journey. It was not an easy journey, and the path ahead was full of challenges and uncertainties. But now there was renewed hope, the hope that the future could be different. They knew that the fight against the shadows of the past would never be completely won, but that the light of truth and redemption would always have the last word. Do you believe the peace achieved in Westborough will be lasting, or will the shadows of the past continue to haunt its inhabitants? What do you think will happen next for Elizabeth and her family? Leave your opinion in the comments. Years later, Westborough had rebuilt itself. The streets, once shrouded in the shadow of an old evil, were now the stage for new stories. Elizabeth Harding, now a woman with a serene gaze, watched her children grow up far from the anxieties of the past. She knew that the struggle she had waged would never be forgotten, but the legacy she left would be one of hope and renewal. Parker, now retired, returned to the city from time to time. He never knew what the future held, but he knew that in Westboro he would always have a home. George, for his part, had reconciled with the ghosts that haunted him, and peace finally settled in. Do you think Westboro's future will always be marked by the shadow of its past? Or has the city truly achieved lasting peace? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you were intrigued by the mysteries of Westboro and the fate of Elizabeth Parker and George, be sure to share your thoughts on the story. What part surprised you the most? Do you think the peace achieved will be lasting? Leave your comment below and join the conversation. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, where the line between the supernatural and reality blurs, revealing mysteries that go beyond what we imagine. Share this story with your friends and help spread the mystery.